Hey everybody, how's it going? We're going to be spending a few minutes in the book of Job today, which I find pretty exciting because I love this book and it seems like it's a universal favorite for a lot of people. Whether you are a skeptic or an atheist or a firm believing Christian or someone just discovering or walking through faith for the first time, you could be a Bible scholar with years and years of study under your belt, or you could be just a layman like I am, just kind of reading the Bible, trying to understand what you can from it to live the greatest life you possibly can. The book of Job is kind of where we all meet because people recognize it's got beautiful poetry and really cool narrative behind it. It has things that happen in there that don't happen anywhere else in the scriptures. It also wrestles with really complex topics that we all want answers to and we all struggle with. And it presents a character, namely Job, that we can all relate to as he struggles with some of these things. And one of the big questions that the book of Job kind of centers around is about God. What is his character? What is he like? How does he view us? How does God operate? So what is his overall plan for us? And does this or that part of our lives fall into that? Particularly as it relates to suffering, because Job is someone who suffers a lot, and people in their lives want to understand, how does this relate to God's plan? Does he exist if in fact he allows all of this suffering? Or is he even good if he allows all of this suffering? These are things that skeptics and Christians alike want to understand, and this is something the book of Job really wrestles with. What's interesting is, in the book of Job, this guy is presented as a righteous man who's doing pretty well. He's a good guy, and he's presented with the loss of several blessings in his life. He loses his kids, he loses his possessions, he loses his health, and he begins to wrestle with some of these questions of the goodness of God and why this is happening to him. He's always faithful. He's been really faithful throughout the whole book. If you keep reading, other people have different interpretations. They say, oh, maybe he lost some faith. I don't see that. He's continually proven or stated to be righteous by God throughout this book. It says and yet through all this, Job never spoke against God. And so there's this constant reaffirmation of Job's goodness as he still struggles with this concept of who God is and why he's allowing these things to happen. And he's got some friends that come along and speak to him, and they wrestle with this concept of God as well. And they kind of come to this conclusion that, well, obviously Job must have done something wrong because in their estimation, God rewards good works. He rewards good behavior. If you follow God, this leads to blessings in life. And if you don't, if there's a departure in your life from God, then this leads to curses and death. And so this is kind of the framework that they're operating under, and they kind of put God within that framework. Now, this is true that in this old covenant system especially, you have this precedent in Deuteronomy where, if you follow God, this leads to life, and if you don't, it leads to death. But this got extrapolated out into broader and broader things to the point where people were starting to believe, well, it's almost like a genie. If I just do these things or say these things exactly right, then God has to bless me. Whereas if I do these other things that are not in line with what he wants, then I'll get curses instead, like a vending machine or something. And this is just not how God works. So it's a really important lesson we get throughout the book of Job that he is struggling with as he looks at his life and realizes, I don't think I've done anything seriously wrong to merit this kind of removal of my blessings or these kinds of curses. And his friends say, no, you must have, because this is how God works. And so they wrestle with this throughout the whole book. Now, throughout the whole book of Job, he is pleading for an audience with God. He wants to be put on trial. He wants to say, God, here's my case. I'm innocent in all of these things, and yet here's the punishment I'm undergoing. Let's correct this. He pleads several times for a mediator and mourns the fact that there is no mediator between God and man. And that's what leads him to ask for an audience with God in the first place. And I think this book asks a question that resonates down throughout time that is finally answered in the Gospels by the person of Jesus Christ, who is the mediator between God and man. And so it's really important that we read the book of Job with that in mind, because I think that is what it's pointing to. It asks these fundamental human questions that we want answers to, that we can find the answers to in the Gospels. And so Job has these questions about things that seem wrong to him. He's questioning how God works and why he would allow these things in his overall plan. He also questions things like, wait, why are you even looking at me in the first place? I'm nothing. He's questioning his own mortality and his own worth in the overall plan of God. And so he's wrestling with this idea of God paying attention to him while he's so insignificant, but he's also wrestling with this idea of this feeling of some sort of unfairness or injustice that he's experiencing. And so he has both of these things in mind, where it's like, I'm worth nothing, and yet, God, am I not worth enough for you to have an audience with me or to treat me fairly in these things that don't feel fair to me? And he wants this mediator. And so in amongst all of this, there's this really interesting verse that I think we skip over. But if we're looking at it from the perspective of it's asking questions that the gospel answers, I think this verse is something that absolutely points to something Jesus did in his life and ministry. It's in Job 14, verse 4. And so just as Job asks why he has no mediator on his behalf, and Jesus fulfills this later, Job also states, who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one. And so he's looking at his life, realizing that he probably doesn't have long left. He's thinking of, his life being so easily discarded as he's going through some of these physical sufferings. And he's thinking about death. And he's thinking, God, but you are clean and I am unclean, and I'll descend into death, which is even more unclean. Nobody can take an unclean thing out of its uncleanness and remain undefiled. And so he's also wrestling with this idea of redemption and resurrection. He's thinking, God, how can you pull me out of the mire of my life or the mire of death and remain clean yourself? And so there's a little bit of hopelessness in this, because the evident answer that Job sees in this moment is, perhaps you can't. Perhaps my life is so unclean that you can't reach down and bring me out of it. Perhaps death is such an unclean thing, so abhorrent to you, that you can't chase me down and reach me there, because it would stain you as well. This is something that he's asking God. This is something he's wrestling with in his mind. And this is kind of true in the old way of thinking about clean and unclean. God says, stay away from unclean things. And if you do come in contact with unclean things, you are also unclean and have to be cleansed. And nobody can pull you out of that uncleanliness. You have to kind of cleanse yourself. There are ritual washings you have to do. There are certain practices you have to follow in order to be made clean again. And so Job kind of cries out for this answer that I think Jesus fulfills. Think of it like this. If somebody is in a mud puddle and they say, please help to clean me. Well, in order for a clean person to get you out of that mud puddle, they have to go into the mud themselves and pull you out. But then both of you are unclean. And so what has actually been affected? Jesus is the answer to this, because he does something radically different. He becomes a human and he descends into death and yet remains unspotted. This is something very unique to God, and it speaks to his holiness and his perfection that can never come into question. And I think we see this in a really amazing way in the story of the woman who is healed of the issue of blood. It's one of the most emotional stories, I think, because it speaks to the compassion of Jesus and the faith that this woman had. That really just touches my heart. So he's in Capernaum, and this woman who's had an issue of blood for 12 years has been suffering for 12 years. She's poor, she's broke, she's unclean. She cannot go near people. She has tried every available option to her to fix this thing, and she is hopeless. But she hears of this Jesus and knows that he has healing powers and thinks to herself, if I could just touch the hem of his robe, then I know that I would be made well. And this is illegal. It's unlawful under the old system, because in her uncleanness, she cannot come in contact with anybody else for fear of also making them unclean. And so she is avoided by society. She is cast out. She is lonely and she is isolated. And she doesn't know how she can be healed of this. She doesn't know. She's asking the same question as Job. Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one. Because if that clean came in contact with me, I would only make it unclean. Death is ruling right now. Uncleanness is ruling right now. But she has faith and touches the hem of Jesus' garment, and she is made whole again. And Jesus looks down to her and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." He feels the power go out of him. And instead of being in some sort of rage that this person did it without his permission, he is compassionate and he speaks kindly to her because he is not tainted by her uncleanness. Instead, her uncleanness is made clean by his perfect cleanness. So now, in the person of Jesus, we don't just have an amazing miracle that happens. We have an answer to the question that Job was asking all along. Who can pull us out of our uncleanness? Who can pull us out of the unclean place of death? Jesus can. Up until this point, death and sin were reigning. Because if a person were to come into contact with sin or with death, it would mean their defilement, not anybody else's cleanliness. But when Jesus comes into contact with people, the Lord of life, life wins. For the first time in human history, life is winning because the answer to this question that Job asks is Jesus can. Jesus can take an unclean person out of his uncleanliness and remain unspotted. And it's only him that can do this. He is the answer that Job was looking for.